Unaware her poor husband had just inherited the $2.8 trillion real estate company she worked for, she pushed him and his elderly mother out into the snow on their anniversary to marry his boss. But what he did would shock her beyond imagination. Rebecca Morrison had spent 5 years climbing the corporate ladder at Sterling Global Properties, becoming the ruthless vice president who showed no mercy to anyone standing in her way. Yet the gentle janitor she'd married, in what she now called her moment of stupidity, had always been beneath her ambitions. Tonight, on their 5th anniversary, with winter winds howling outside their modest apartment and his 72-year-old mother visiting to celebrate, Rebecca stood in designer heels worth more than David's monthly salary, her phone glowing with a text from Richard Sterling, the silver-haired CEO who'd promised her everything she'd ever wanted. David had prepared a small dinner with trembling hands, his janitorial uniform still damp from mopping the executive floors where his wife commanded respect he'd never receive, completely unaware that 23 hours earlier his arranged father, the reclusive billionaire Jonathan Cole, had died in Singapore, naming David as the sole heir to Cole Enterprises, the parent company that owned Sterling Global Properties and 847 other corporations across 6 continents. His mother clutched her worn Bible, whispering prayers for her son's marriage, while snow began falling heavier outside. But Rebecca saw only obstacles to her new life with Richard, who demanded she cut all ties tonight. The inheritance document sat in a lawyer's briefcase 3 blocks away, waiting for morning delivery. But Rebecca had already made her choice, her hands reaching for her husband's threadbare coat. What forces had shaped this woman who valued corner offices over compassion? And what secrets had David's mother kept about the family fortune her son never knew existed? Could one night of cruelty shatter 5 years of quiet devotion? Or would the revelation of David's true identity transform not just his life, but expose the rotting core of the empire Rebecca worshipped? When Rebecca opened the apartment door to the freezing February night, what chain of events would her actions unleash across boardrooms, courtrooms, and the very foundations of the real estate dynasty she'd sacrificed everything to join? The apartment on Riverside and 53rd had never felt like home to Rebecca Morrison, but rather like a prison sentence she'd been serving for 5 years, counting down the days until her escape. She stood now in the cramped living room, her Prada heels clicking against the worn linoleum that David had scrubbed on his hands and knees just that morning, trying to make everything perfect for their anniversary dinner. The scent of his attempt at beef Wellington, a dish he'd practiced for weeks, watching YouTube videos on his cracked phone during lunch breaks, filled the small space, but Rebecca's nose wrinkled with disgust rather than appreciation. "You actually thought this would impress me," she said, her voice cutting through the apartment like a blade through silk, sharp and final. David looked up from the table he'd set with their wedding china, the cheap set from Target that had been all they could afford back then, though Rebecca had forgotten they'd once stood in that store together, laughing and dreaming. His eyes, soft brown and infinitely kind, held confusion, but not yet pain, because after 5 years of her increasingly cruel remarks, he'd developed a protective numbness that worried his mother deeply. "I know it's not fancy like the restaurants you go to for work," David said quietly, his janitor's uniform swapped for the one nice shirt he owned, pressed carefully, though the collar was fraying at the edges. "But I wanted to make tonight special, Rebecca. 5 years, that's 5 years too many." Rebecca cut him off, her perfectly manicured hand, nails done at the salon where she'd also gotten the Brazilian blouse that had cost more than David's weekly grocery budget, waving dismissively through the air. 5 years of living in this shoe box. 5 years of pretending I'm happy being married to a janitor. 5 years of watching my colleagues' faces when they ask what my husband does. From the small bedroom, David's mother, Elelina, emerged, her 72-year-old face lined with the kind of worry that only mothers carry. She'd taken the bus 3 hours from Newark to be here tonight, bringing with her a small cake she'd baked herself and the gold locket she wanted to give David, the one that contained the only photograph of his father he'd ever seen, though she'd never told him the full truth about Jonathan Cole. "Rebecca, dear," Elelina began, her voice gentle but firm, the voice of a woman who'd once moved through boardrooms herself before choosing a different life. "Perhaps we should all sit down and don't, dear me," Rebecca snapped, turning on the elderly woman with eyes that had gone cold months ago around the time Richard Sterling had first invited her to his private office after hours. And frankly, Elena, your presence here is part of the problem. Do you know what my boss said when I mentioned my mother-in-law was visiting? He laughed. He actually laughed and said, God, Rebecca, you're really committed to this working-class cosplay, aren't you? The words hung in the air like poison, but Rebecca felt no shame, only the intoxicating rush of finally speaking her truth. Outside, snow had begun to fall heavier, the weather forecast having predicted the worst February storm in 15 years. But Rebecca had checked her phone obsessively and knew Richard's penthouse had a backup generator and heated floors. David's hands trembled slightly as he set down the serving spoon he'd been holding, that small silver one from the antique shop where he'd spent 2 weeks' worth of tips, because Rebecca had once mentioned loving vintage silverware. What are you saying, Rebecca? I'm saying, Rebecca announced, pulling a phone from her clutch and holding it up like evidence in a trial, that Richard Sterling, you know, the CEO of Sterling Global Properties, the company I actually matter at, has asked me to marry him, and I said yes. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Elena's sharp intake of breath and the distant sound of car horns from the street below. David stood frozen, his mind struggling to process words that seemed to come from a stranger, because the woman he'd married, the one who'd cried happy tears when he proposed with a simple silver band at the community park, couldn't possibly be the same person delivering this calculated cruelty. But we are married. We're married right now. Tonight is our anniversary. A marriage that was clearly a mistake, Rebecca said, her voice gaining strength from Richard's text messages that kept lighting up her phone. Is it done yet? I'm waiting for you. I was 23, David 23, and stupid, fresh out of business school with loans crushing me, and you were there being all sweet and humble, talking about honest work and building a life together. But I've grown since then, I've evolved, and you're still mopping floors. What Rebecca didn't know couldn't know, because the universe sometimes holds its secrets, until the cruelest possible moment was that 3 blocks away, in the law offices of Chen and Associates, attorney Michael Foster sat reviewing the most extraordinary inheritance case he'd handled in 30 years of estate law. The documents spread across his mahogany desk told a story that would have stopped Rebecca's heart had she known. Jonathan Cole, the notoriously private billionaire who'd built Cole Enterprises from a single property in Brooklyn into a $2.8 trillion empire spanning continents, had died suddenly in Singapore 23 hours earlier. The will, ironically drafted just 6 months ago after Jonathan had finally hired investigators to find the son he'd abandoned decades earlier, was crystal clear in its intentions. David Anthony Morrison, born David Anthony Cole, before his mother had changed his name to protect him from a father she deemed too dangerous and ambitious, was the sole heir to everything. The empire, the properties, the investments, the controlling shares in Sterling Global Properties, the private jets, the art collection, the compound in the Hamptons, the villa in Tuscany, and yes, the $2.8 trillion that Forbes would confirm by morning. Michael had tried calling David's number 17 times that evening, but David had silenced his phone because Rebecca hated when he answered calls during dinner, even though she spent half their meals scrolling through her own device. The documents were prepared for delivery first thing tomorrow morning, but Michael had wanted to give David a heads up tonight, sensing somehow that knowing before the lawyers arrived might be important. He couldn't have known how important. Back in the apartment, Elena had moved to stand beside her son, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of support that made Rebecca's lip curl with contempt. The old woman's eyes held something Rebecca couldn't read, a mixture of sorrow and strange anticipation, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for years. Rebecca, David tried again, his voice stronger now, despite the trembling in his hands, because his mother's presence gave him courage he didn't know he possessed. I know I'm not successful like your colleagues. I know cleaning buildings isn't glamorous, but I've loved you since the day we met, and I've worked hard to what? Rebecca interrupted, her laughter sharp and cutting, to provide this. She gestured around the apartment with theatrical disgust, indicating the second-hand furniture David had refinished himself, the bookshelves he'd built from reclaimed wood, the photographs he'd framed of their early days together when her smiles had been genuine. Richard's penthouse is 12,000 square ft, David 12,000. It has a private elevator, a wine cellar worth more than this entire building, and a view of Central Park. That costs more per year in property taxes than you'll earn in your lifetime. Elena's grip on David's arm tightened, her other hand moving to the locket around her neck, the one containing secrets she'd kept for 35 years, waiting for the right moment that now seemed to have arrived in the worst possible way. Rebecca, there are things you don't understand about David's family. About his family. Rebecca's laugh was cruel, practiced in the mirror until it conveyed maximum contempt. You living in that tiny apartment in Newark, taking the bus everywhere, wearing clothes from the Salvation Army. That's exactly the problem, Elena. David comes from nothing, and he'll always be nothing, and I refuse to be dragged down anymore. The words struck Elena like physical blows, but she stood straighter, her 72-year-old spine stiffening with a dignity that came from years in worlds Rebecca couldn't imagine. My son is worth more than you will ever comprehend, young lady. His father abandoned you both, Rebecca said viciously, having heard the story once years ago when she'd still pretended to care. Some deadbeat who disappeared before David was born, leaving you to raise a kid alone. Real impressive lineage there. What Rebecca didn't know, what Elena had kept secret, even from David to protect him from a legacy she'd feared would corrupt his gentle soul, was that Jonathan Cole hadn't abandoned them by choice. He'd been given an ultimatum by his own father, the business or the family, the empire or the love, the money or the child. Jonathan, young and ambitious and fatally flawed, had chosen wrong, spending the next 35 years building his trillion-dollar monument to that mistake, eventually trying to make amends, but finding Elena had hidden too well. The investigators had found them anyway, because enough money can find anyone. But Jonathan had died before reconciliation could happen, leaving only the inheritance as his apology. "Get out," Rebecca said. Suddenly her decision crystallizing into action as Richard's latest text arrived. "Baby, I need you here now, don't make me wait. Both of you get out of my apartment." "Our apartment," David said quietly, finding his voice in the same place. He'd always found strength in defending his mother. "Both our names are on the lease, Rebecca." "You can't just watch me," Rebecca said, moving to the coat closet and yanking out David's threadbare winter jacket and his mother's worn wool coat. "I want you gone before I leave for Richard's. I want every trace of this mistake erased so I can start my real life." Elena stepped forward, her eyes blazing with an anger David had never seen in his patient, long-suffering mother. "You're making the worst mistake of your life, young woman. When you learn the truth, Rebecca laughed, throwing the coats at them with force that betrayed her desperation to end this scene, to get to Richard's penthouse, where champagne was chilling and promises of executive positions were waiting. "The truth is I'm about to marry a man worth billions, a man who runs the most powerful real estate company in the world, a man who can give me everything I deserve. That's the only truth that matters." She pulled open the apartment door, letting in a blast of freezing February air and swirling snow that had intensified into near blizzard conditions. The weather report on the small TV in the corner was warning people to stay indoors, declaring a state of emergency as temperatures plummeted to dangerous lows. "It's degrees out there," David said, looking at his elderly mother with concern that Rebecca found pathetic. "Mom has a heart condition. We should have thought of that before showing up uninvited to ruin my anniversary with your poverty," Rebecca said coldly, though Elena had been invited weeks ago when Rebecca had still been playing the role of loving wife before Richard's proposal had changed everything. "There are shelters. Aren't there churches? Figure it out. I want you gone in 5 minutes or I'm calling the police and reporting you for trespassing." The legal absurdity of threatening to have her own husband arrested for trespassing in their shared apartment didn't occur to Rebecca, or if it did, she didn't care. Richard had lawyers who could handle such details, and soon she'd have access to resources that made current laws feel like suggestions rather than rules. David looked at his mother, seeing her shiver already from the cold air pouring through the open door, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of quiet resignation that Elena recognized from his childhood, the look he got when he decided to accept pain rather than fight it, to protect others rather than defend himself. "Okay," David said softly, helping his mother into her worn coat, his hands gentle as he buttoned it for her like she'd once done for him. "We'll go, Rebecca, if that's what you really want." "It's what I want," Rebecca confirmed, already texting Richard. "On my way soon, they're leaving now. And David, I'll have divorce papers sent to wherever you end up. Do me a favor and sign them quickly so I can marry Richard before the summer social season." She pulled her own designer coat from the closet, the Canada Goose parka that cost $10, purchased with the Christmas bonus from Sterling Global Properties, while David had gone without a new coat for 3 years. Elena watched her with eyes that held pity rather than hatred, which somehow made Rebecca angrier. "You'll regret this," Elena said quietly, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact from a woman who'd seen enough of life to recognize its patterns. "Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but when you learn who David really is, who his father was, what he's about to inherit." "Inherit?" Rebecca laughed, the sound echoing in the small apartment that suddenly felt cavernous. "What's he going to inherit? Your bus pass and your Bible, please. The only thing David's inheriting is a lifetime of mediocrity, and I'm not interested in sharing it." She physically pushed David toward the door, her hands on his back with force that would bruise, though he didn't resist, because he'd never believed in fighting with women, a principle his mother had taught him that now seemed foolishly old-fashioned. Elena followed, moving slowly on arthritic knees that the cold would make worse, clutching her small overnight bag and the cake she'd baked, though leaving the locket behind on the kitchen counter in her confusion and distress. "Happy anniversary," Rebecca said with vicious irony as she shoved them into the hallway, where the building's inadequate heating made the air only marginally warmer than outside. "And David, don't come crawling back when you realize what you've lost. I'm done slumming it with janitors and their charity case mothers." She slammed the door with finality, the sound reverberating through the thin walls, and immediately felt lighter, freer, ready for the life she deserved. Through the peephole she watched them walk toward the stairs. The elevator had been broken for weeks. Another sign of the poverty she was escaping, and felt nothing but relief. Rebecca didn't see Elena stumble on the third step down, her heart condition causing a flutter that made her grip the railing with white knuckles. She didn't see David catch his mother, supporting her weight with arms made strong from years of manual labor, whispering reassurances, while his own heart shattered into pieces he'd never fully collect. She didn't see them exit into the storm that had worsened impossibly, the wind now howling between buildings like a living thing, the snow so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. She didn't see David remove his own threadbare jacket to wrap around his mother despite her protests, leaving himself in just his dress shirt against temperatures that could kill within hours. Rebecca saw none of this because she was already in the bedroom they'd shared for 5 years, throwing clothes into a suitcase with movements made frantic by excitement. She texted Richard updates every 30 seconds. "They're gone, packing now, be there in 20 minutes, I love you." His responses came quickly, each one fueling her certainty. "Good, bring only what you need tonight. Tomorrow we'll send someone for the rest. Or better yet, just buy all new things. I want you to have everything fresh, everything perfect. You're mine now, Rebecca, finally mine." What Rebecca didn't know, what she couldn't see because she'd stopped looking anywhere but up the corporate ladder, was that Richard Sterling's marriage proposal had nothing to do with love and everything to do with the hostile takeover he'd been planning for months. His investigators had discovered that Cole Enterprises' mysterious owner was dying, and that controlling shares in Sterling Global Properties would soon be in play. Richard needed Rebecca's insider knowledge of the company's weaknesses, her access to confidential files, her willingness to betray anyone for advancement, all traits he'd cultivated carefully over 18 months of calculated seduction. He was 53 to her 28, married already to his third wife, though separated conveniently, and his promises of promotion came with fine print. Rebecca had been too dazzled to read. She'd be useful until she wasn't. Valuable until someone more valuable appeared. Loved until love became inconvenient. But Rebecca saw only the penthouse, the power, the prestige, as she locked the apartment door behind her 20 minutes later, her designer luggage rolling smoothly across floors her husband had cleaned just that morning. The storm had worsened impossibly by the time she reached the street, and her Uber driver, who would later testify at the proceedings, though Rebecca couldn't know this yet, expressed serious concerns about driving in such conditions. "Ma'am, they're saying people shouldn't be out unless it's life or death. Temperatures dropped to -15 with wind chill. There's already been. Just drive," Rebecca commanded, climbing into the luxury SUV she'd called, having refused to take the subway like poor people did. "I'm going to the Sterling Towers penthouse, and I'm paying you double to get me there fast." The driver, needing the money because his own wife was in the hospital, a detail Rebecca didn't bother asking about, pulled carefully into traffic that had thinned to almost nothing as sensible people heeded the emergency warnings. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away in the opposite direction, David and Elena huddled in the doorway of a closed bodega, the elderly woman's lips already tinged with blue despite David's jacket wrapped around her shoulders. He'd tried 4 shelters, all full beyond capacity, and the churches in the area were locked until morning, their clergy having gone home before the storm hit. David's phone, the cracked one he'd been meaning to replace but couldn't afford, buzzed insistently with missed calls from a number he didn't recognize, but his frozen fingers couldn't manage the screen properly. And besides, his only concern was his mother, whose breathing had become labored and whose eyes kept closing in a way that terrified him. "Mom, stay with me," he said, rubbing her hands between his own, trying to generate warmth through friction, though his own hands were nearly numb. "We'll find somewhere warm, I promise, just stay awake." Elena looked up at her son with eyes that held secrets she'd kept too long, and in that moment, watching him sacrifice his own warmth to preserve hers, she made a decision. "David, there's something you need to know about your father, about who you really are. The locket, I left it on the counter, but there are papers, documents in my apartment in Newark, in the blue box under my bed." "Don't talk, Mom," David said, pulling her closer as the wind drove snow into their inadequate shelter. "Save your strength. When we get somewhere safe, you can tell me anything you want." But Elena knew with the certainty that comes to mothers sometimes that time was running short, not for the inheritance revelation which would happen with or without her, but for the truths that could only come from her lips. "Your father didn't abandon us because he didn't love us. He was forced to choose and he chose wrong, but he spent his whole life regretting it. He built an empire thinking money could fill the hole where you should have been." A violent coughing fit seized her, and David watched in horror as his mother's body convulsed with the effort to breathe. Her heart condition, exacerbated by stress and extreme cold, was triggering arrhythmia that would have killed her within hours without medical intervention. But they were blocks from the nearest hospital, and David's frozen fingers couldn't dial 911 properly on his damaged phone. At exactly that moment, Rebecca's Uber was pulling up to the Sterling Towers, where the doorman rushed out with an umbrella despite the blizzard, where the heated marble floors of the lobby felt like heaven, where Richard waited in his penthouse with champagne and promises and the documents he'd need Rebecca to sign, giving him power of attorney over her assets, making her complicit in the insider trading he'd been orchestrating, tying her to crimes she didn't yet know she'd be committing. "You made it," Richard said, pulling Rebecca into his arms with practiced passion, his cologne expensive and his smile perfect, and his eyes utterly empty of anything resembling love. "My beautiful, brilliant future wife. Are they gone? Really gone? Thrown out into the snow?" Rebecca confirmed, laughing as she accepted the champagne glass he pressed into her hand, the liquid gold and sparkling and cold like her heart had become. "David and his pathetic mother are probably in some shelter right now, finally getting what they deserve." "Perfect," Richard said, getting her toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that showed the storm raging across Manhattan. The city transformed into a white wasteland where visibility was measured in feet rather than miles. "Then let's celebrate to power to getting everything we want no matter who we have to step on to get it." They clinked glasses and Rebecca felt triumphant, vindicated, certain that she'd made the right choice and that her new life was beginning in this moment of crystalline perfection. She didn't know that 4 blocks away, a good Samaritan named James Chen, no relation to the lawyers waiting to deliver David's inheritance, though coincidences pile up strangely in stories like this, had found David and Elena in their doorway and was helping them into his late-model Honda, cranking the heat to maximum and driving them to Mount C Hospital despite the dangerous conditions. She didn't know that the emergency room doctors would later testify that Elena arrived hypothermic and in cardiac distress, that her survival was uncertain for 3 hours, that David never left her side despite being hypothermic himself, that his selflessness impressed every nurse and doctor who witnessed it. She didn't know that attorney Michael Foster, frustrated by his inability to reach David by phone, had finally decided to brave the storm himself, arriving at the apartment on Riverside and 53rd to find it dark and empty, with only the evidence of Rebecca's hasty packing and the abandoned anniversary dinner growing cold on the table. She didn't know that Michael, being thorough in ways that make great lawyers, had checked with the building's doorman and learned about the scene earlier that evening, about a well-dressed woman throwing a man and elderly woman out into the storm, about screaming that echoed through the thin walls, about cruelty delivered on an anniversary that should have been celebrated. And she certainly didn't know that Michael, his lawyer's instincts sensing something important, had taken photographs of the abandoned dinner had collected the locket Elena had accidentally left behind, had interviewed the doorman and gotten written statements, had begun building a file that would become crucial evidence in proceedings Rebecca couldn't yet imagine. But all of that was still ahead, still unfolding in the wings of a stage where Rebecca believed she was the star, but was actually just a supporting player in a drama larger than her ambitions could comprehend. In Richard's penthouse, Rebecca signed the papers he slid across the table, barely reading them because Richard's hands were on her shoulders and his voice was honey in her ear, and the champagne had gone to her head. Just formalities, he assured her. Estate planning, power of attorney. Standard prenuptial preparation. Sign here and here and here. She signed her signature flourishing and confident, legally binding herself to conspiracies she didn't understand and obligations she couldn't fulfill. All while the storm raged outside and her husband fought to save his mother's life in a hospital 10 blocks away. At Mount C, the doctors had stabilized Elena. Around 11 p.m. her heart rhythm restored through emergency intervention, her body temperature slowly climbing back towards safe levels. David sat beside her bed, still wearing just his dress shirt because he'd refused the blanket nurses offered, insisting they use it for another patient who needed it more. Mr. Morrison, a young resident, said, approaching with a clipboard and exhaustion in his eyes from a night of storm-related emergencies, "Your mother's stable now. She'll need to stay several days for observation, but she's asking for you." David moved to Elena's bedside, taking her hand in his own, which had finally regained feeling and with it the pain of frostbite that would leave scars. "I'm here, Mom. You're safe. Everything's okay." Elena's eyes opened clearer now than they'd been in hours, and she gripped his hand with surprising strength. "The papers in Newark under my bed, blue box. Promise me you'll look, David. Promise me you'll know the truth before they tell you officially." "Before who tells me what?" David asked, confused, but willing to promise anything that would ease his mother's distress. "Promise," Elena insisted, her voice gaining strength. "Tomorrow, first thing the truth about your father, about who you are." About a knock on the hospital room door interrupted her, and Michael Foster entered, still brushing snow from his expensive overcoat, briefcase in hand, and determination in his eyes. "David Morrison, I'm Michael Foster, attorney with Chen and Associates. I've been trying to reach you all evening about an urgent matter regarding your father's estate." David stared at the lawyer in confusion, his mind struggling to process words that seemed to come from an alternate reality. My father's been gone since before I was born. There is no estate. There's nothing." Michael and Elena exchanged a look that David couldn't interpret, and in that moment, the first domino of revelation began to fall, though the cascade would take days to complete and would ultimately destroy Rebecca's carefully constructed new life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. "Mr. Morrison," Michael said gently, pulling a chair close to the hospital bed and opening his briefcase to reveal documents that looked impossibly important and official. "Your father was Jonathan Cole. He died yesterday in Singapore, and you are the sole heir to Cole Enterprises, which includes $2.8 trillion in assets, controlling shares in 847 companies worldwide, and among many other holdings, complete ownership of Sterling Global Properties, the company your wife works for." The words hung in the air like stars, impossible and brilliant and world-altering, and David's mouth opened, but no sound emerged because his brain couldn't process the magnitude of what he was hearing. Elena squeezed his hand. "I kept it secret to protect you. Your father, Jonathan, he was given a choice when I got pregnant. His father, your grandfather, said he could have the business or the family, but not both. Jonathan chose wrong, but he spent 35 years trying to find us, trying to make amends. He died before we could reconcile, but he left you everything, David. Everything he built thinking of you. 2.8 trillion, David whispered, the number so large it seemed fictional, meaningless. A figure from news reports about tech billionaires or national budgets, but never from his own life. That's not possible. I'm a janitor. I clean floors. You're the owner of the company whose floors you've been cleaning, Michael said with a small smile that suggested he appreciated the irony. As of 9:00 a.m. yesterday morning, Singapore time, when your father's will went into effect, you became one of the wealthiest individuals in human history. And Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you something important. Has anyone asked you to sign any documents recently, made any unusual financial requests because there are people who might try to take advantage? Rebecca, David said suddenly, everything clicking into place with horrible clarity. My wife, ex-wife, she threw us out tonight. Threw us out into the storm because she's marrying her boss, Richard Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Global Properties. Michael finished, his expression hardening into something that suggested 20 years as an estate lawyer had made him an expert in human greed. The company you now own. Mr. Morrison, I need you to tell me everything that happened tonight. Every detail, because something tells me there are legal issues we need to address immediately. As David recounted the evening, his voice breaking occasionally as he described Rebecca's cruelty, his mother's collapse, the storm that had nearly killed them both. Michael took notes with increasing interest, his legal mind already constructing the case that would unfold. She pushed you out on your anniversary, Michael repeated slowly, ensuring he had the details correct. Into a declared state of emergency while you were unaware that you just inherited the company she works for, the company her new fiancé runs, though technically you own it now, which makes Richard Sterling your employee rather than her boss. She didn't know, David said quietly, because even now, even after everything, his nature was to defend rather than attack. She had no idea about the inheritance. She just thought I was worthless, Elena finished bitterly, her heart monitor beeping faster as anger elevated her pulse. She thought my son was worthless, so she threw him out like garbage along with his elderly mother into conditions that could have killed us. That's attempted murder, Mr. Foster. That's at least criminal negligence. That's complicated, Michael said carefully, though his eyes suggested he agreed with Elena's assessment more than his words. Admitted, but what's not complicated is that David now has resources to ensure justice is served, whatever form that takes. Mr. Morrison, I need you to make some decisions. First, we need to secure your inheritance officially. That means appearing at my office tomorrow to sign documents, meet with the board of Coal Enterprises, and begin the transfer of assets. Second, we need to decide how to handle Sterling Global Properties. Your father owned 87% of the company through various holding entities. Richard Sterling is CEO, but you can replace him at will. And third, David interrupted softly, we need to figure out what to do about Rebecca. The hospital room fell silent, except for the beeping of Elena's heart monitor and the howling storm outside the window. David sat in his chair wearing a hospital gown now because his dress shirt had been too damaged by the cold, and tried to process a reality that had shifted so completely that his previous life seemed like a dream. He thought about Rebecca's face as she'd pushed him toward the door, the contempt in her eyes, the way she'd laughed when his mother had tried to intervene. He thought about 5 years of marriage that had started with genuine love, but ended with cruelty he hadn't seen coming, or maybe had been too kind to acknowledge. And somewhere in the still functioning part of his mind that his mother had raised to value justice over revenge, mercy over cruelty, David began to formulate a plan not for destroying Rebecca, because destruction wasn't in his nature, but for ensuring that truth had consequences and that the people who thought themselves powerful learned about real power. What happens, David asked Michael slowly, if I show up Monday morning at Sterling Global Properties, not as a janitor, as the owner? Michael smiled, the expression transforming his professional face into something almost predatory. That depends on what you want to happen, Mr. Morrison. You own the company. You can do literally anything you want. Fire everyone, keep everyone, restructure. Sell, dissolve, anything. You have absolute authority. I want, David said carefully, his mother squeezing his hand in support to see her face. I want Rebecca to understand exactly what she threw away tonight. I want her to know that the poor janitor she pushed into a blizzard is actually the man who owns her entire world. Is that petty? That's human, Elena said firmly, her voice stronger now as medication and warmth restored her strength. That's consequences and that's justice, David. She tried to kill us tonight. She deserves to know what she's lost. Michael pulled out his phone, already making calculations and plans with the efficiency of a lawyer who'd handled hostile takeovers before. I'll arrange an emergency board meeting for Monday morning, 9:00 a.m. We'll notify Richard Sterling of new ownership, but not the owner's identity. Corporate protocols allow for that. We'll have security prepared. And Mr. Morrison, I'd suggest bringing your mother. Elena deserves to see this too. As midnight approached and the storm showed no signs of abating, David sat in the hospital room with his mother and his lawyer, making plans that would shake Manhattan's real estate world to its foundations. He felt strange, not happy exactly, because happiness seemed impossible, while remembering Rebecca's cruelty, but purposeful in a way he'd never experienced while mopping floors or cleaning executive bathrooms. Meanwhile, in Richard Sterling's penthouse 12 blocks away, Rebecca had fallen asleep. In the master bedroom that overlooked Central Park, her designer nightgown purchased that afternoon in anticipation of this first night with her new fiancé. Her dreams filled with corner offices and power lunches and the respect she'd always craved. She didn't dream of David at all, having compartmentalized him completely as a chapter closed and forgotten like a book she'd finished and donated because she'd never want to read it again. Richard, however, wasn't sleeping. He sat in his study reviewing the documents Rebecca had signed without reading, making phone calls despite the late hour to lawyers and accountants and the board members he'd bribed or blackmailed into supporting his takeover plans. Cole Enterprises' owner was dead. The inheritance was probably in probate, and if Richard moved fast enough, he could consolidate power before anyone knew what was happening. "She's perfect," he told his attorney in a call at 1:00 a.m. dumb enough to sign anything, ambitious enough to betray anyone, and disposable once we've used her knowledge of the company's vulnerabilities. By spring, I'll have controlling interest even if Cole's heir shows up, and Rebecca will have served her purpose. The attorney made appropriate noises of agreement, neither man knowing that their call was being routed through a company-owned telecommunications system that David now technically controlled, or that Michael Foster had already begun the process of securing all of Sterling Global's electronic communications for the legal proceedings that were coming. Sunday passed in a blur of paperwork and preparation. David signed so many documents, his hand cramped, met via video conference with board members across 6 continents, who expressed varying degrees of shock at their new owner's youth and apparent inexperience, and tried to process the reality that he now controlled more wealth than most countries' GDP. Elena was released from the hospital Sunday afternoon with strict instructions to rest and avoid stress. Though both she and the doctors knew that avoiding stress would be impossible given what Monday would bring, she wore new clothes that David's newly assigned executive assistant, a terrifyingly efficient woman named Patricia Chen, no relation to the lawyers, though coincidences persisted, had purchased and delivered, having burned the old ones because they'd been too damaged by the storm. "How do you feel?" David asked his mother as they rode in the chauffeured Bentley that was apparently one of dozens of vehicles he now owned, heading toward a luxury hotel suite where Patricia had arranged for them to stay, rather than returning to the riverside apartment. Vindicated, Elena said honestly, looking at her son with pride that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the fact that even in his moment of greatest hurt, he'd chosen to protect her rather than himself, and a little bit excited to see that horrible woman's face tomorrow. "Is that wrong? If it is, we're wrong." Together, David said, squeezing her hand. That night, unable to sleep in the hotel suite that was larger than his entire former apartment, David stood at the floor-toseling windows and looked out at Manhattan spread below him like a glittering circuit board, every light representing a life being lived, every building a world unto itself. Somewhere out there, Rebecca was sleeping peacefully, secure in her choices, confident in her new life. By noon tomorrow, that confidence would be shattered, and David felt strangely sad about it, not for Rebecca exactly, but for the death of whatever small part of him had still believed in the love they'd shared at the beginning, before ambition had poisoned everything it touched. Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the storm having passed, and left the city buried under 2 ft of snow that sparkled under a brilliant blue sky. At 7:00 a.m., David dressed in the suit Patricia had provided. Bioni, she'd explained, though the brand meant nothing to him and tried not to feel like a fraud. The man in the mirror looked like a CEO, powerful and polished, but David still felt like a janitor playing dress-up. "You look like your father," Elena said, emerging from her room in an elegant dress that made her look 10 years younger and radiant with anticipation. "Jonathan would have been so proud, David, not of the money, he knew the money was hollow, but of the man you are, the kindness you've shown even to people who have hurt you. That's the real inheritance." At 8:00 a.m., they climbed into the Bentley again, Michael Foster waiting with a briefcase full of documents and a smile that suggested he was enjoying this case more than he'd enjoyed work in years. "Ready to change your life again? Ready to show someone what consequences look like?" David said quietly, and they drove towards Sterling Towers, where board members were already assembling, where Richard Sterling was preparing to meet his new owner, without knowing the owner was the janitor he'd humiliated countless times. Where Rebecca was arriving in designer heels and a designer suit, confident that her first day as future Mrs. Sterling would be perfect. The board meeting was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. in the executive conference room on the 84th floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows showed all of Manhattan, and beyond, where the table was Italian marble, and the chairs cost more than David's former monthly rent. Richard Sterling had arrived at 8:00 a.m., unusually nervous, because meeting a new owner was always unpredictable, but confident that his position was secure. He'd run Sterling Global Properties for 15 years, delivered consistent profits, cultivated board loyalty through various legal and less legal means. Rebecca arrived at 8:30 a.m., having spent an hour getting ready in Richard's penthouse bathroom. Determined to make an impression on the board as Richard's future wife and the company's future first lady, she'd texted her assistant to cancel all her meetings for the day, wanting to be available for whatever Richard needed as he navigated this transition. "You look perfect," Richard had told her that morning, kissing her in a way that felt performative, but that Rebecca interpreted as passion. "Just stay in the background during the meeting. These things can get political, and I don't want you caught in any crossfire." Of course, Rebecca had agreed, happy to watch her powerful fiancé work, secure in the knowledge that her own promotion to senior vice president was coming soon, probably announced at the same time as their engagement. At 8:55 a.m., Michael Foster entered the conference room where Richard and the board members were waiting, making small talk and drinking coffee from cups that cost more than David had earned in a week as a janitor. Michael's entrance caused immediate silence because lawyers arriving before new owners was unusual protocol suggesting complications. "Gentlemen," Michael said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd handled billion-dollar transactions with the same ease most people handled. "Grocery shopping, and Ms. Morrison, I didn't realize you'd be here. Interesting." Rebecca looked up from her phone, confused by the lawyer's tone but not yet alarmed. "I'm here to support Richard during the transition. I'm his fiancé." "Yes," Michael finished smoothly. "I've heard. Congratulations on your upcoming marriage, and my condolences on your recent divorce, which I understand happened just this weekend. Very fast work." The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and Richard's expression hardened. "Mr. Foster, what exactly?" "All will become clear in a moment," Michael said, checking his watch with theatrical precision. "The new owner asked me to prepare the board for some unusual circumstances. First, he's very young, 35. Second, he's very new to this industry. Third, he has some personal connections to this company that might surprise you. And fourth." The conference room door opened, and Patricia Chen entered, her presence commanding immediate attention, followed by Alelana Morrison in her elegant dress, and finally David, wearing his bean suit and looking like he'd been born to executive power, even though his hands still trembled slightly from nerves. The board members all turned to look, seeing strangers and waiting for explanations, but Rebecca's face underwent a transformation that David would remember for the rest of his life. Her skin went from healthy tan to paper white in seconds. Her mouth opened but produced no sound, and her eyes widened with shock so profound it looked almost like physical pain. "Rebecca," David said quietly, his voice carrying across the marble and glass space with unexpected authority, "surprised to see me." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard Sterling's expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and calculation in seconds, his political instincts sensing disaster, but not yet understanding its magnitude. The board members looked between David, Rebecca, Richard with growing interest, sensing drama that would make the usual corporate tedium worth attending. "David." Rebecca finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing here? This is a board meeting. You can't just security should have." "Security works for me now," David said, moving to the head of the table where Richard had been sitting just moments before, taking the chairman's seat with a confidence that surprised him. "As does everyone in this building, including you, Rebecca, and you, Richard. Let me introduce myself properly to the board. I'm David Morrison, formerly David Cole, son of Jonathan Cole and sole heir to Cole Enterprises, which means I own 87% of Sterling Global Properties. Effective immediately, I'm assuming active control of the company. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Board members checking their phones and tablets for confirmation. Richard's face turning red, then purple as the implications hit him. Rebecca making small gasping sounds. Like a fish drowning in air, Michael smoothly distributed documentation to each board member, proving David's identity and ownership beyond dispute. "This is impossible," Richard said, his voice strangled by shock and rage. "You're a janitor. You clean toilets. You cleaned your office every Tuesday night for 5 years." David finished calmly, his mother taking a seat beside him with a smile that could cut glass. "Usually, while you were working late, planning your takeover strategies, taking calls about bribing board members and manipulating stock prices, all of which happened to occur in rooms I was cleaning, where you never bothered to lower your voice. Because janitors don't matter, do they, Richard?" Richard's face went from purple to white, understanding dawning that his careless arrogance had been his downfall, that 5 years of treating the janitor as invisible furniture had given that janitor evidence of crimes that could destroy him. "Rebecca," David continued, turning his attention to his wife, who looked like she might vomit or faint or both. "I believe you were planning to marry Richard here. On what grounds exactly, given that we're still legally married, and I haven't signed any divorce papers yet?" "But I pushed you," Rebecca started, then stopped, her lawyer's brain finally catching up and realizing that every word she spoke now was potential evidence against her. "You pushed me out into a blizzard," David finished helpfully, "along with my elderly mother who has a heart condition during a declared state of emergency when temperatures were degrees on our anniversary. While I was unaware that I just inherited this company, and you were unaware that your fiancé's boss, me, could fire him at will. It's almost poetic." Ilelana leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of righteous anger. "My son nearly died that night trying to keep me warm. I spent hours in cardiac distress. We were found by a stranger who saved our lives. No thanks to you. And all because you were too selfish and cruel to show basic human decency." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but whether from remorse or self-pity was unclear. "David, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about your father, about the inheritance. If you'd known I was rich, you would have treated me with basic respect," David asked, his voice sad rather than angry. "That's actually worse, Rebecca. That means the only thing wrong with pushing me into a storm was that I didn't deserve it because of my bank balance. What about pushing me out because I'm a human being, because we were married, because it was our anniversary?" "Mr. Sterling," Michael Foster said, redirecting attention to the CEO who'd been trying to edge toward the door. "I should inform you that the Securities and Exchange Commission will be receiving a full file of recorded conversations tomorrow morning regarding your insider trading activities, stock manipulation schemes, and the bribes you paid to board members Hayes, Carlson, and Woods. Mr. Morrison, as the new majority owner, has decided to cooperate fully with federal investigations. Your termination is effective immediately, and your severance package has been reduced to the minimum allowed by your contract given cause for termination." Richard Sterling, one of Manhattan's most powerful real estate executives just 30 minutes earlier, stood frozen as his world collapsed around him. "You can't. I'll fight this. You'll lose," Patricia Chen said, speaking for the first time with a voice like silk-wrapped steel. "Mr. Morrison has evidence, witnesses, documentation, and approximately $2.8 trillion in resources to deploy in legal proceedings. I'd suggest you get a very good attorney, though they won't come cheap, and you should probably notify your wife, your actual legal wife, Mrs. Sterling, who's very interested in the affair you've been conducting with Ms. Morrison here." Rebecca made a choking sound as that particular grenade exploded, realizing that Richard was married, that she'd signed documents without reading them, that she'd destroyed her marriage and her future for a man who'd been using her all along. "The documents you signed Friday night," Michael informed her almost gently, "gave Richard Sterling power of attorney over your assets, made you legally complicit in several pending crimes, and bound you to a prenuptial agreement for a marriage that can't legally occur since he's already married. You might want to consult your own attorney as well. I can provide referrals if needed." The board meeting, scheduled for 2 hours to discuss quarterly reports and strategic planning, ended after 45 minutes, with Richard Sterling escorted from the building by security. Rebecca collapsing into a chair, with tears streaming down her face, and David Morrison officially installed as Sterling Global Properties' new chairman and CEO. The board members, being practical people who cared more about their portfolios than morality, quickly pivoted to supporting the new regime, offering congratulations and assistance with whatever David might need. Only board members Hayes, Carlson, and Woods looked uncomfortable, knowing that Michael's briefcase probably contained documentation of their own crimes that would emerge in due time. As the room cleared, only David, Elena, Michael, and Rebecca remained. The Manhattan skyline spread behind them like a backdrop for a play about wealth and consequences. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked finally, her voice small and broken. All her confidence evaporated like morning fog. David looked at her for a long moment. This woman he'd loved enough to marry, who destroyed that love with methodical cruelty. "Now you have choices. You can keep your job at the company if you want. I won't fire you for personal reasons, only professional ones. Your position as vice president stands unless you violate company policies, but you should know that your professional reputation is damaged, that people will know you tried to marry your way to power while betraying your husband. That Richard Sterling used you and discarded you. Is that the career you wanted?" "I don't know what I wanted," Rebecca whispered honestly. Maybe the first honest thing she'd said in months. "I thought I wanted power and respect and wealth. But sitting here watching you, the man I threw away, become everything I dreamed of being, I think maybe I just wanted to feel important, to matter, to be more than a poor girl from Baltimore who clawed her way through business school." Elena's expression softened slightly, recognizing something in Rebecca's words that David was too hurt to see. "You mattered when David loved you. You threw that away for a fantasy of power that was never real. My son would have given you the world if you'd just been patient and kind. Instead, you chose cruelty and nearly killed us both for it." "I know," Rebecca said, tears flowing freely. "Now I know what I did. I know what I am. And I know I'll never forgive myself for it, even if somehow you find the grace to forgive me." David stood buttoning his suit jacket and preparing to begin his first day as CEO of a company he'd been cleaning just days earlier. "I don't forgive you, Rebecca. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I also don't hate you. You showed me who you really are, and I'm grateful for that truth, even though learning it nearly killed me and my mother. You can stay at Sterling Global if you work hard and follow the rules, but we're done personally and legally. My lawyer will send you proper divorce papers, and this time I expect you to sign them quickly." He moved toward the door, his mother on his arm, leaving Rebecca alone in the conference room, where her dreams had died and reality had finally caught up with her choices. The story of David Morrison's inheritance spread through Manhattan real estate circles, with the speed of scandal growing more dramatic with each retelling. By Tuesday, news outlets were covering the story. Janitor inherits trillion-dollar empire. By Wednesday, Rebecca's role had leaked, and social media was calling her the Snow Queen and Blizzard betrayer. By Thursday, Richard Sterling had been arrested on multiple charges, his lawyers scrambling to negotiate deals that wouldn't include prison time. Rebecca submitted her resignation on Friday, unable to face the whispers and stares, choosing to leave New York entirely and start over somewhere that didn't know her story. Before she left, she wrote David a letter 12 pages long, handwritten because it felt more honest, apologizing in detail for every cruelty, explaining her thinking without excusing it, and wishing him happiness with a sincerity that came too late to matter. David read the letter once, filed it away in a drawer he'd probably never open again, and returned to the overwhelming task of learning to run a trillion-dollar empire while staying true to the values his mother had taught him about kindness and integrity. 6 months later, Sterling Global Properties had been restructured with new leadership, new ethics policies, and a new name, Cole Properties International. David had kept many employees, fired the corrupt ones, and implemented programs that paid janitors and service workers living wages with full benefits because he remembered what it felt like to be invisible. He never remarried, though he dated occasionally, always wary now of people who wanted his money rather than his heart. Ilelana lived in a beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn that David bought her, finally comfortable, but no more interested in luxury than she'd ever been, because contentment came from character rather than bank balances. And sometimes, late at night, when he couldn't sleep, David would stand at the windows of his office, the same office where Richard Sterling had once ruled and where David had once mopped floors and think about that snowy February night that had changed everything. He'd wonder if Rebecca had found peace, if she'd learned from her mistakes, if somewhere she'd become the person she might have been if ambition hadn't poisoned her heart. He never got answers to those questions because their story had ended that Monday morning. The conference room concluded with the finality that comes when consequences catch up with cruelty, and truth reveals the price of betrayal. The inheritance had made him wealthy beyond measure, but the storm had made him wise, and David Morrison knew which gift mattered more. 3 years. The Manhattan skyline had changed in 3 years, but not as much as the people who moved through it. David Morrison stood in his office on the 84th floor of what was now Cole Properties International, reviewing architectural plans for a new affordable housing initiative that would transform 6 blocks of Brooklyn into mixed-income communities where janitors and CEOs could live as neighbors. The irony wasn't lost on him, using his father's real estate empire to dismantle the very class divisions that had nearly destroyed his life. Mr. Morrison, Patricia Chen appeared in the doorway, her efficiency undimmed by 3 years of service, though she smiled more now than she had at the beginning. Your mother's here for lunch, and there's someone with her you might want to see. David's eyebrows rose with curiosity, but he simply nodded and made his way to the executive dining room where Leilani waited, looking healthy and vibrant at 75. The heart condition that had nearly killed her, now managed with excellent medical care that David's resources provided. Sitting across from Leilani, looking thinner and somehow older despite being only 31, was Rebecca. David stopped in the doorway, his heart doing something complicated that felt like surprise and hurt and curiosity all tangled together. Rebecca looked up, her eyes meeting his with an expression that held humility rather than the confidence that had once defined her. "Hello, David," she said quietly. "Your mother invited me. I can leave if you want." "Sit," Leilani said firmly, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Both of you, I didn't survive cardiac arrest in a blizzard just to watch you two dance around unfinished business for the rest of your lives." David sat, because his mother's voice still carried the authority that had raised him, but his eyes stayed on Rebecca with questions he didn't know how to ask. "I've been in Portland," Rebecca began, her hands wrapped around a water glass like she needed something to hold on to, "working at a non-profit that helps formerly incarcerated people re-enter the workforce. My boss is a woman who served 8 years for embezzlement, crimes not unlike the ones Richard tried to involve me in, except she got caught and I didn't." "You're working at a non-profit," David repeated, the words sounding strange because they didn't fit the Rebecca he'd known, the one who'd measured worth in corner offices and designer labels. "For $47,000 a year," Rebecca confirmed with a small smile that held self-awareness rather than bitterness. "I rent a studio apartment, take the bus, shop at Goodwill. Your mother found me 6 months ago through some investigation firm. She's been talking with me, helping me understand things about myself I'd refused to see." David turned to Leilani with surprise. "You've been meeting with her for 6 months. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you weren't ready," Leilani said simply, "and because Rebecca needed to do her own work before facing you. She's been in therapy, David, real therapy, the kind that breaks you down and rebuilds you. She's been volunteering at homeless shelters, working with storm victims, doing the kind of service that teaches humility the hard way." "I'm not here for forgiveness," Rebecca said quickly, seeing something shift in David's expression. "I don't deserve that, and I don't expect it. I'm here because your mother thought we both needed closure beyond divorce papers and news stories. I'm here to tell you I understand now what I couldn't see then." "And what's that?" David asked, his voice careful but not cruel. Rebecca took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and painful, that pushing you out into that storm wasn't the worst thing I did. The worst thing I did was years of small cruelties that led up to that moment. All the times I made you feel worthless. All the times I valued your position over your person. All the times I looked at you and saw only what you couldn't give me rather than what you were freely offering. The storm was just the culmination of 3 years of choosing ambition over love. She pulled something from her purse, a worn photograph that David recognized as one from their wedding day when they'd both been young and hopeful and genuinely happy. "I kept this not because I think we can go back, but because I need to remember that I was once capable of real love before I let other things corrupt it. You deserved so much better than what I became, David." Leilani reached across the table and squeezed Rebecca's hand. Gesture that shocked David because his mother's capacity for grace had always exceeded his own. "She's been paying penance in ways that matter." Not grand gestures, but daily choices to be better. That counts for something. David studied Rebecca for a long moment, seeing not the polished executive who'd destroyed their marriage, but a person who'd broken herself and was slowly rebuilding from pieces. What happened with Richard Prison? Rebecca said flatly. 18 months so far of a 6-year sentence. He tried to contact me when he was first arrested, wanting me to testify in his defense, but I refused. My lawyer, the one I hired after realizing what I'd signed, helped me negotiate immunity in exchange for evidence about his schemes. I didn't have much that was useful, but what I had I gave. He deserves everything he got. And your career in real estate? Rebecca's laugh was bitter but honest, dead and buried. No one would hire me after the scandal. And honestly, I'm glad that world turned me into someone I hate. The non-profit work. It's hard and frustrating, and I'll never be wealthy doing it. But I sleep better now than I did making 6 figures. I'm helping people who have made mistakes rebuild their lives, which feels appropriate given that I'm doing the same thing. She's good at it too, Elena added. I've checked. Her boss says Rebecca has a gift for understanding how ambition can corrupt judgment, how desperation can lead to bad choices. She uses her own story to connect with people others have given up on. David absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the woman sitting before him with the one who'd pushed him into the snow with such calculated cruelty. Why are you really here, Rebecca? What do you want from this lunch? Nothing, Rebecca said, and the word carried such conviction that David believed her. I want nothing from you, except to say I'm sorry in person, not just in a letter you probably never finished reading. I want you to know that I've thought about that night every single day for 3 years, that I've replayed every moment and understood exactly how close I came to killing you both through my selfishness. I want you to know that the person who did those things still exists in me. I'll always be capable of that cruelty, but I'm choosing every day not to be her. She stood up slowly, gathering her worn purse that probably came from the goodwill she'd mentioned. Your mother wanted this meeting, but you don't owe me anything, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not even acknowledgement. I've made peace with being the villain in your story, David, because I earned that role. But I wanted you to see that villains can sometimes recognize what they've done and try to do better, even if it doesn't change the past. Wait, David said, surprising himself. Rebecca paused, hope flickering across her face before she visibly suppressed it. Sit down, finish lunch. You came all this way. They sat, the 3 of them, and talked through a meal that gradually grew less awkward as years of unspoken words finally found voice. Rebecca told stories about her work in Portland, the single mother she'd helped find housing after years of homelessness, the former drug dealer she'd coached through job interviews until someone finally took a chance on him. David shared his own stories about restructuring coal properties with ethics at its foundation, about the former janitors he'd promoted to management positions, about learning that wealth's true purpose was in what it could build rather than what it could buy. Elena watched them both with satisfaction that came from understanding something they didn't yet see, that the storm had broken them both in different ways, and the breaking had been necessary for the becoming. As lunch ended and Rebecca prepared to catch her bus back to the airport, she'd refused David's offer of a car service with gentle firmness. She paused at the door of the dining room. I heard you're dating someone, she said, and her smile was genuine without any trace of jealousy. The kindergarten teacher from Brooklyn. Your mother showed me pictures. She looks kind. She is kind, David confirmed, thinking of Amy Rodriguez with her wild curly hair and passion for teaching children that society had written off. We're taking it slow, building something real on honesty rather than expectations. She knew me as David the volunteer, not David the billionaire, which helped. I'm glad, Rebecca said, and meant it with the sincerity that comes from growth. You deserve someone who sees your heart first. Never did, not really, and that's the part I regret most. Not the money I missed out on, but the man I was too blind to appreciate. She left then, walking to the elevator with her shoulders straight and her head high. Not with the arrogance she'd once carried, but with the dignity that comes from surviving your own worst mistakes and choosing to become someone better. Elena stayed behind watching her son watch Rebecca leave. You still love her a little bit, don't you? No, David said honestly, then reconsidered. Maybe, but not the person she is now or the person she was then. I think I love the person we both were on our wedding day, before life and ambition and weakness corrupted things. That's worth mourning, even if it can't be recovered. That's wisdom, Elena said, standing with the slight stiffness that came from age but no longer from illness. Your father would have been proud of you, David, not for the money you inherited or the empire you've built, but for staying human while doing it. That's harder than anything else. 6 months after that lunch, David married Amy Rodriguez in a small ceremony in Brooklyn, surrounded by family and friends that included former janitors and kindergartners and non-profit workers. Rebecca sent a card with a generous donation to the Affordable Housing Initiative and a note that simply said, "Wishing you all the happiness I once had and threw away. You deserve it." Richard Sterling was released from prison after serving 4 years of his sentence, immediately launching a consulting business that failed within months because his reputation preceded him. He lived in a modest apartment in Queens, bitter and diminished, unable to understand how the janitor he'd dismissed had risen while he'd fallen, never comprehending that character determines trajectory more than cleverness. Cole Properties International thrived under David's leadership, becoming known not just for profits, but for principles, not just for buildings, but for the communities those buildings created. David kept his office on the 84th floor, but regularly worked from different properties across the city, remembering what it felt like to be invisible and ensuring no one in his employee ever felt that way again. Alina lived to be 82, surrounded by grandchildren. Amy and David eventually had 3 and died peacefully in her Brooklyn brownstone, satisfied that she'd protected her son from his father's legacy while ensuring he inherited his father's resources. Her last words to David were, "You became what Jonathan tried to be, wealthy in the ways that matter. I'm proud of who you chose to become." And Rebecca continued her work in Portland, never marrying again, but building a life of service that gradually erased the Snow Queen from Google searches. As more positive stories replaced the old scandal. She kept David's wedding photo in her desk drawer, not as a shrine to lost possibility, but as a reminder that everyone is always one choice away from becoming their worst self or their best self. And the choosing never stops. The snow that had nearly killed them, that February night 3 years earlier, became in memory and meaning. The storm that had revealed truth about love and cruelty, about worth and ambition, about the difference between inheriting wealth and inheriting wisdom. David had received both, but only one had saved him. And on winter nights when snow fell on Manhattan, David would stand at his window with Amy beside him, watching the city transform into something beautiful and temporary, and feel grateful for the storm that had destroyed his old life and made space for this better one. The inheritance of $2.8 trillion had changed his circumstances, but the inheritance of his mother's values had changed his character.